Welcome to A Little Idea, a series of discussions about books, how to put them together, where to take them, and how to create a story you are truly proud of. If you are someone who is looking to tell a story, or you can't rest until you've committed that story to the page, this is the series for you. So last week, we began the process of putting together a manuscript and how to overcome the challenges of completing it. This week in our second episode, it is time to reach out and take your book to publishers. What are the ways of getting a publishing deal, and how do you determine what is the best deal for you? Well, that is some of the stuff we'll be covering tonight. Joining me tonight for this discussion is a very special guest, Franscois McHardy. He's the head of publishing at Booktopia, but he's also worked at the likes of Random House South Africa, Hachette Australia, Simon & Schuster Australia, and more. He's been in the industry for over 20 years, and it is a delight to have him this evening. Francois, it's a pleasure to have you here. Welcome to A Little Idea.
Thanks, Nick.
So I think it's fair to say that, a lot of authors, they start their manuscript, very few finish them in the context of that stuff, because it is a huge process. But say you have got to the end of your first draft, you've done your revisions, you've completed that manuscript, and you're suddenly going, okay, now what? What is the next direction for someone who is looking for that, looking to try and get their story to an audience?
Right. Well, firstly, if you do get to that stage, you should give yourself a pat on the shoulder, for starters, because it is a great achievement. Many people, if not most, have desires to write a book, but very few people have the discipline and the tenacity to sit down and actually execute on that. So that's a huge achievement in its own right. And I would say even if it never gets published, in sort of the traditional way, you should be very chuffed to have done that in the first place, for starters. What I'd say to the person is the thing you should not do is to ask your friends and family to read your draft, because and it's sort of the obvious thing that many people do, but friends and family will usually feel obliged to tell you what they think you want to hear, whereas what you really do need at that point in the sort of creative process is a dispassionate, sometimes brutal feedback in terms of what the next steps are. What's lacking, where's the, if it's a work of fiction, where's the narrative not working, or are there some characters that are underdeveloped, or plot lines that aren't working? If it's non-fiction, have you forgotten to include some critical aspects of the subject that you're covering? So I think finding somebody to read it for you who's qualified to do that. And a lot of people will say that they've got editorial experience or are good editors, but editing a manuscript, is not about correcting the spelling or, fixing the punctuation. A proper edit, especially what we would call a structural edit, is a far deeper, more comprehensive part of the creative process. It's where, a good editor will say to you, I'm really, this character is not working for me, and I think you should basically kill them off because they're not adding anything to the plot line. And actually this part of the story is really compelling and it's very topical. And if you can develop that part of it, you're going to reach a much bigger audience, and you need to go and rewrite. And obviously that's a very big thing to ask somebody to do, because a lot of writers spend months, if not years, of their lives crafting that first draft. And when they finally finish it, they think, that's it, I'm done. It's near to perfect, because I don't really want to look at it again. But the best writers, that I've worked with over the years are the ones who don't blink when they've got to go back and write another draft and take that feedback on board. And it's hard, because obviously you've invested a big chunk of your life in writing a book or a manuscript. It's you've got a lot of yourself invested in that. Joanne Harris, in her recent book 10 Things About Writing, talks about that. She says, when you write a manuscript, you're putting a piece of your soul into that manuscript. And so you've got to ask yourself, what is your soul worth, you know? So you've got to find that balance between not, you know, over thinking the process that you've already gone through, and being able to step back from it for a while, give it over to somebody, which is very confronting, can be quite daunting, and bracing yourself for the feedback. And don't fish for compliments, because that's I think something that a lot of writers do is that they give it to somebody, and what they really want to hear is, oh my God, I loved it, it's brilliant.
Yeah.
And, you know, and of course that's a natural instinct, but the, you know, truly great books don't just drop out of the sky. They are crafted over many drafts, often with lots of pain and back and forth with, you know, an editor, and it's a relationship of trust. Now, of course, if you've never been published before, or even if you have, you can't just necessarily call on somebody and say, you know, yes, my manuscript, can you read it? Because it's a big investment to make, you know, and people with those kinds of skills are actually quite scarce, and their skills are worth a lot of money, and they don't come cheap. So I think if you don't already have a publisher, or you don't have an agent who can help you, you might need to consider paying for that service. And I would say don't hesitate to do that, because if you get the right editor, you will, you know, it's money well spent.
Yeah, it's interesting you touch on this, because there was with my first edition of my book, I had people who I at the time couldn't afford to get a professional editor to have a look at it, and I did the best I could by asking people who I knew, writers, other people, my parents. So I basically made every single mistake that you just mentioned there with that first edition. But the comparison when I did the second edition of my book, it was huge, because and it was such a fantastically educational experience in terms of learning about the value of killing your darlings, but doing it in a way that actually it makes it just enhances the story so much, because it gives you that reality of, well, hey, this is something that could potentially really make your story even more captivating, which is fantastic. And then, like you say, when you actually then approach some the world of publishing, like a publisher, you have an agent or whatever, it adds so much value to actually have had that professional look it over and go, this is how this book works, or this is how this book is functioned, and it's had that professional eye that has dotted the I's and crossed the T's, which is so valuable. Yeah. You touched on it a little bit, but we're going to dive into this now, because we have the manuscript. You've now edited it, or you've had the chance for someone to have a look at it, and you want to get it published. So if you're someone with very limited experience in this space, what are the options that are available to you?
Well, I mean, the most traditional method is to submit it to a publisher, you know, an established trade publisher who has a submission process and an in-house editorial or publishing team who can assess a manuscript and make a decision about whether or not it's something that they want to publish and invest in. And you know, that's the sort of one model. That does still happen, obviously, because, you know, many of the books you see in bookshops have turned into books and that way. But you know, that model has been shrinking for a long time. I mean, the book industry has been under a lot of pressure over the last 10 to 20 years in terms of developments in technology, the proliferation of alternative entertainment channels. You know, gaming has gone into the stratosphere in terms of levels of sophistication. Streaming has proliferated, and you know, binge television. You know, and we're all guilty of it. You know, getting stuck into series and watching far too much, you know, video content than we would have previously, and probably reading, you know, less than we should have. But and obviously technology formats have also changed the way in which the publishing industry works and the viability of publishing. So the growth of ebooks has been quite significant. Most trade publishers will now report that has plateaued. They report on average about 15% of volume seems to be around about where a lot of the trade publishers have ended up in terms of their total ebook sales. Clearly for some categories or genres like romance or mass market fiction, that percentage that ebooks present of their volume sales can be much higher, but that's an aggregate really across all formats. So the model has changed a lot. So I should sort of preface, the options for publishing by saying that. So what's happened is, and there's also been a lot of consolidation in the international publishing sort of arena, where you had Hodder and Stoughton used to be a separate company, and Headline was a separate company, and they got together and became Hodder Headline, and then they were purchased by Lagardère and they became Hachette globally. When I was working for Random House in the 90s, they were a family-owned business, and then they were purchased by Bertelsmann, who merged them with their existing publishing interests, which was Transworld in the UK and the Bantam Doubleday Dell group in the US, and it became the Random House group grew, but it also gobbled up a lot of great imprints that used to operate autonomously. And in these sort of corporate takeovers, you often find that editorial divisions become consumed by others and lose their independence, and results in fewer options available. And of course, in more recent years, you've had the Penguin Random House merger, and they in turn have purchased Simon & Schuster globally, which is it's going to result in really one large global publishing house less, available for authors. So the landscape is changing all the time. And then at the same time, you've had self-publishing platforms proliferate in the form of, you've got Kindle Direct Publishing, you've got Kobo Writing Life, you've got, many other self-publishing platforms that have come up. And in the old days, going back 20 years or so, the concept of vanity publishing was, used to describe self-publishing, and it was sort of looked down upon. And that really has changed a lot. There's absolutely no shame in self-publishing, or custom publishing as it's sometimes called, because if you have to sit around and wait for a traditional publisher to get to your manuscript and decide to publish it, you might be 100 years old before that happens. And what a lot of authors have decided is they just can't wait around for that. They're going to take control of their own destiny and their own intellectual property and make it happen, and that's fantastic. And of course, there are notable examples of titles that have been self-published and then ended up being picked up by mainstream publishers, like 50 Shades of Grey was originally self-published. That's probably the best example of all.
Or Matthew Riley, I recall, as well.
Indeed. And Matthew's a good example of an author who has all of the qualities of success, in terms of that tenacity and that entrepreneurial spirit very early on in their careers as well. So I think the traditional model is still the preferred model, and being part of one of the big established publishing brands does have a certain element of prestige associated with it. It also means you gain access to the infrastructure that those companies own, which is significant because it's been built over, in some cases, more than 100 years. And more importantly, the sort of supply chains. And supply chains might sound like, something rather crude to speak about in the context of, creative pursuit, but you need to be very aware of the business end of publishing as an author, no matter how, comfortable you are with that or not, because access to the market is really what makes all the difference. Being able to reach those consumers, develop awareness in the minds of consumers who do read in those genres that your book has been written in, those are critical, and they don't come cheap, and they have to be built over a long period of time. So I would say, coming back to your question about what are the ways to get published, it's, you've got the traditional model, and then you've got, the sort of custom publishing, self-publishing option. And within that, there are different sort of levels of publishing available. I mean, at Booktopia Publishing, we have 3 tiers. The top tier would be that traditional model where we see a manuscript that's been pitched to us, either direct by an author or from a literary agent, or even from a co-publishing partner in somewhere else in the world, because a lot of publishers sell rights to other territories, and it's a very good pathway for publishers to find new titles. That's the one option. And the second option is where we actually have a custom imprint called Noble Books that we use to publish, where the author actually takes the risk on the cost of the publishing services associated with producing the book and creating that physical, format, or the ebook format for that matter, or the audio, and then providing access to the market, because that's really important. If you don't have a distribution option at your disposal as an author, you can write and publish the best book in the world, but it won't reach the audience. And the technical aspects of how that works and how that sells through is, there's a lot of stuff going on. There's the metadata, the actual sort of digital data associated with the book, the ISBN, the bibliographic data, the pricing information. That all has to go into countless databases around the world for that title to become discoverable through online retail channels and including into actual bricks and mortar bookshops. And then the third tier that I refer to would be the sort of pure self-publishing, where the author just feels really strongly about having the physical book in hand. And even if they're only going to sell 50 copies to their friends and family, it's just something that's really important to them. And that's entirely valid. And in that instance, you would pay for the services associated with creating it into a book, but you may not be able to find a distribution channel into the market, and it may not be for sale in bookshops. And you've got print on demand, which then sort of falls into place and provides that pathway to the consumers. If somebody wants an actual physical printed copy of the book, they can order it from any one of many different reseller channels, and that book will be printed. I mean, the world's largest print-on-demand group is the Ingram-owned Lightning Source, which is very well known in the book community. Most resellers, like your Booktopias or your Angus and Robertsons or your Amazons of the world, list all of those titles for sale on their websites. And if somebody orders it, it actually gets printed within hours and dispatched, and the person can have that book within a week or two, as opposed to something that might already be in stock. So from the consumer's perspective, they don't know nor care where the book has come from or when it's been produced. They've got the copy that they can read. Obviously, the digital channels, formats are a lot more immediate. If you've got an ebook edition available, the person can download it and start reading it within minutes, or download the audio. But yeah, those are really the sort of major pathways to market.
Yeah, thank you. I know, I'm aware it's a very complicated question because there are so many options out there, and I love the points that you make about thinking about this, because at the end of the day, it for authors out there, it is a business. The business factor is a huge part of it. As much as some authors might feel very icky about saying that or admitting to it, the one thing that I have often found, and I think it's off the back of this time that I've been doing this new edition, is whenever people ask me, hey, what's the how have you been able to do all of this, and get into do signings in bookshops and doing interviews or meeting people, and the simple answer I say is, you've got to think about it, when you are presenting your book, just the mindset of, this is the book and this is why it's worth your time, which in that sense, you have to kind of really make sure your business model really makes sense. Yes. And honestly, I think it's something that authors should be incredibly open to, because it's essentially another way of storytelling. It's a way of, you can describe the book however you like, through the way that you market it and aim it at the particular audience you want to. It's just a real dotting your I's, crossing your T's thing. I want to kind of touch on these kind of options that you've presented here, and kind of do a little bit of a pro and con situation with each. Thank you so much for mentioning Joanne Harris, by the way. I was very lucky enough to be able to interview her for the Booktopia podcast last year, and I know that she does a lot of advocacy for potential change in the industry, and I know that she has got some concerns about the way things have been changing over the last couple of years. We'll start first with that traditional sense that traditional model that you're talking about, submitting to a major publishing house. If you are an author, what are the pros that come with doing that? What are the cons with that, with going in that route?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the pros obviously come back to the scale that the big companies have in terms of their global reach, their marketing and publicity infrastructure. That many of them can still afford to have good in-house editors, whereas a lot of publishing companies over the years have gone through waves of cost cutting, and unfortunately, some of the first people who go when companies are doing that are the editorial personnel, and there's really no substitute for a great editor. Significantly undervalued in the creative process, and I think so those are some of the cons, and obviously sales infrastructure, and also the critical mass they've got with the big sales channels. So if you look at a market like the Australian market, I mean, obviously, Booktopia is now the largest bookseller in the country, but that's partly because of the long tail model of e-commerce, where you can offer 5 million titles for sale, and you can hold stock of 150,000 copies in your warehouse. The average bookshop has a much smaller range of titles. It's probably more like 15,000 titles in your sort of average suburban bookshop. And then if you look at some of the channels that sell very large volumes, like what we would call the deep discount stores, or DDSs, which in Australia would be your Kmart, Target, Big W, they sell a lot of books, but they sell them very cheaply, and they often use them to attract customers to buy other products. And so other market channels struggle to compete with those price points, but they do. So getting into those stores requires you to have a very big catalog and a big purse when it comes to paying co-op marketing contributions or advertising contributions, rebates. And the bigger companies tend to have the buying power to buy shelf space in those chains and those channels that can sell a lot of books. So it really depends on what kind of book you've written. If you've written a fast-paced crime thriller, in the vein of Kathy Reichs or Jeffrey Deaver or James Patterson or Michael Robotham, to mention a few of those sort of big brand authors, then you're going to want to be in those channels, and your chance of getting into them is going to be so much better if you are published by one of the big companies. But then if you've written, a beautifully crafted, more literary sort of work of fiction, and you think you might be in line to win the Booker Prize, you might be better off working with, one of the sort of smaller boutique publishing companies. Again, in the Australian context, you'd be looking at companies like Allen and Unwin or Text or Scribe, who are all wonderful publishers and have a great track record for publishing works that are more thoughtful and more niche-y in that sense. And then they've got access to the channels that do really well, which would be more your chains and your independent book selling sector. So it's horses for courses, really. But so those would be the pros, really. I mean, the cons come down to, again, also to scale, and then in the sense that these companies publish tens of thousands of new titles across their international groups every year. So when I was working at Random House, or even within the Shep or the Simon & Schuster sort of groups that all have big companies in all of the major English language countries, we would probably be publishing 40 to 50,000 titles a year across the group or more. And if you think about the average bookshop, they're buying only a couple of hundred new releases every month to be able to sort of restock their new release section and get fresh stock coming in. And they would be shown many thousands of titles every single month by the sales team members and the key account, managers from all of the large, medium, and small companies and distributors. And so they've, you've got these funnels that are filtering out as such titles at every step of the way. And so as an author, you've got to ask yourself, if you're going to be published by Penguin Random House or, Hachette, what is the sort of the chance of you being one of the lead titles that's going to be really focused on in the sales cycle every month? And it's not a criticism at all. I mean, it's really just being pragmatic about your chance of your book being one of the 200, or 400 titles shown by one of these big companies that have been filtered down from a couple of thousand, or more in that month. And it happens every month, literally every 30 days. Trucks pull out the back of the store and offload, pallet loads of new stock. And the old stuff gets packed up into boxes if it hasn't sold, and it gets returned for full credit to the publishers, which is a shameful way to do business, but that's the way the model works, really. And very few titles end up being what we would call core backlist, so Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, or Catch-22, or Pride and Prejudice, or in the non-fiction, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, or Who Moved My Cheese, or those are the sort of classic titles that a good bookseller should never be without in the A to Z of the fiction section or the non-fiction category. But they are very few. You'd be talking about a fraction of a percent of books that end up being considered core backlist. So the major con there is that unless you are going to be one of those 10 to 20 lead titles in the 1 to 200 shown by that company in a sales cycle, you will be consigned to obscurity. You'd be lucky if you become what's known as mid-list. And then there's the dreaded indent list, which is an industry term that's used for titles that have been published that are not going to be actively sold or shown to the decision makers in the booksellers. They are just appear on a list of metadata that happens to be fed into those channels. In case somebody wants to order it, they can find it on their their databases. So you really don't want to be there. So I think as an author, you've got to ask yourself, and it's basically being pragmatic and being realistic about your prospects. Now, having said that, there were 12 publishers who turned down
J.K. Rowling.
a story about a boy wizard at boarding school. Because firstly, they said books on magic don't sell, and furthermore, sort of the 12-year-old category, it's really hard. It's sort of not quite kids, not quite YA, and you're doing it and want to do it in hardback. Sorry, not going to work. Number 13, of course, was Bloomsbury, and that the rest was history. So there are wonderful exceptions to the sort of baggage that the book industry carries around and uses to make decisions. And so I would say never assume that the rules of engagement should apply to you, but it is worth being aware of how the industry works, and asking yourself, what are my chances of being one of those those few lead titles? And if I'm not going to be one of them, maybe I'm better off going with a smaller publisher who's going to give me more attention and where my book's going to stand out more in their mix.
Yeah, that's a great summary, great examination of it. I definitely agree. You've got to be honest and know, and it's again, as well as thinking about the niche of your audience in terms of the subject matter, it has to fit similarly in terms of your publishing direction, and it influences who you want to go with. How does that compare, say, for example, you touched on getting books presented to you by having a literary agent,
Yes.
As another option. So how, if you're going, for example, through an agent who you sign up with, how does that compare? Does that give you any more? Does it give you a foot in the door? Does it make any impact whatsoever in comparison to submitting it just yourself?
It definitely makes a difference. I mean, if you can find an agent, especially a good one, you absolutely should. I mean, a good literary agent, especially nowadays, performs a lot of the tasks that used to be, done in-house by publishers. A lot of great editors have, left the publishing sector and gone into literary agencies or become agents themselves, and so they've got the insights in terms of how the business works. But what they will do is they will work with you as an author to get your manuscript into the kind of shape where they really are confident it's now ready to submit. Because as an author, even if you've had some editorial input, you're not necessarily in the best position to know whether it's absolutely ready for submission, to a publisher. Publishers are inundated with manuscripts, and even if they have a very well developed submission process and a very organized way of filtering it, it can take quite a long time to get through all of the manuscripts that are being submitted. And there are just more and more people writing, and so there are more and more manuscripts, especially now with the COVID crisis globally. I think a lot of people have been forced into confinement and have finally, find themselves in the conditions where they actually can write that book they've always wanted to write. So ironically, there's been this proliferation now of manuscripts, and I think that will continue. And that's not a bad thing either, because good stories will always, come out and will always rise to the top. But a literary agent, especially a good one, can really make a difference to your prospects as an author. Having said that, finding an agent is very, very hard. It's harder than finding a publisher, because there are not that many agents around, or and certainly not ones that have capacity to take on new clients. So even especially the good ones tend to be quite selective because they can afford to be, and so they've got certain things that they're looking for in an author that are different to what a publisher is looking for. They're looking for somebody who absolutely can write, who's got a great manuscript already in hand, or potentially a track record of already having been published, and maybe they're looking to move agents, or looking, finally getting one, so they also have insights into what publishers are looking for, or what the opportunities are in terms of the categories that are doing very well in the marketplace, or gaps in the market where a book is actually needed, but it hasn't been written yet. So they've got, they're usually more experienced, seasoned sort of industry professionals who have a lot of things going on that give them the kind of insights that enable them to match a manuscript or an author with a publisher that they know will likely like it. And it's all about selling. I always remind people that the entire publishing process is all about selling, whether you like sales or not.
Yeah.
As an author, when you've written something and you're pitching it to either a publisher or an agent, or you're selling yourself really, and you're selling your work, your creative work. I mean, even within publishing companies, if an editor likes something, they often have to go to an acquisition forum within the company, and they've got to pitch it to colleagues who might include sales colleagues and colleagues from the sort of the design department and from the publicity department, and they get feedback on it, and they've got to act as an initial advocate for the author, and they work to get people to buy into it. And then, of course, once the book has been, once the covers have been designed, the creative team go to a covers meeting, and they're presenting their work, and they're essentially selling their creative work internally to get consensus on what's the best cover for this. And then, of course, then you get to the actual, selling to the booksellers, who are the gatekeepers in terms of what goes on sale in the bookshops, or what gets merchandised on the home page or the category pages in an e-commerce environment. So there's a lot of, and that's, we haven't even got to the consumer yet, to who try to sell, to convince. And then, the publicity part of it is getting them, selling to the media to get them to want to talk about a book, whether it's to review it or to interview the author. So everything is about selling. And so I think it's good to understand the psychology of selling and how to influence people from an early stage, not to be insincere about it, but to understand which buttons you need to press to sort of get buying.
Yeah, and I'd imagine like an agent like that would really help, especially if you have a product that you know what you're doing with. Even I'm assuming though, obviously they'd be doing things like if people would be worried about the financial issues that would come up with purchasing an agent. Obviously that would be that would be something where it simply comes down to money, whether you can afford them or not.
Well, the thing about agents is that most of them work on a commission basis, so you don't have to pay them up front to take you on as an author. And I used to work for somebody who had a really wonderful turn of phrase, and I won't use his exact language, but he used to say that 100% of nothing is still nothing. And so a lot of people think, oh, paying an agent's commissions can range from, as low as 10% up to 25%. And they think, wow, I'm the one who's created this work, and I've put my whole life into this, and they're just going to take 25% of my income. And that's a very short-sighted way to look at it. The commission that the agents earn, the difference between you potentially not finding a publisher at all, or finding, the wrong publisher, versus getting a really great deal with a major publisher, and all that, critical mass that you get behind it to sell significant volumes, can be the difference between, earning a couple of $100 of royalties versus, actually making a living from it, and being able to write full time, which, to be honest, very few authors are ever able to do from the income from their writing.
Yeah. It's about investment and how much you want to put in terms
Correct.
of that.
And a good agent really does earn their keep. I would have no hesitation to recommend agents, because they look after so much. They're out there fighting for your interests all of the time. Keeping publishers honest, and looking for other territories to sell, other languages. They go to international, trade fairs, or they used to, at least when we were allowed to travel. But there's still a lot of virtual, book fairs going on. I mean, I get daily correspondence from a range of different authors or agents pitching projects to me, because they're good at what they do, and they know what kind of books we're looking for, and they're working hard for their authors. Having said that, as with anything in life, having a bad agent is also not a great idea, because you can feel like you're in bondage to the person. And the same goes for having a bad publisher, for that matter, because the publishing process and the publishing agreement is a very intimate and very long-term relationship. I always used to joke and say that it's a bit like getting married, except it's much harder to get divorced, when you're an author, because if it's for the duration of copyright, that's a pretty long-term commitment. It's until 70 years after you're dead.
It is a complicated thing, and it's so interesting to examine and see the repercussions of it and examinations of it with that. I know we are aware, like kind of starting to run a little short on time, but the last kind of way of talking about publishing, and we've already alluded to this a little bit, is the self-publishing or your custom publishing, your hybrid publishing route. I love the term you used of what it was originally referred to as vanity publishing. It's and I know that a lot of people do publishing this way now. Pros and cons of going self-publishing. And particularly around, because there is a lot of misconceptions out there. Are there some that are justified or not? What are the pros and cons of self-publishing?
Well, look, I mean, the biggest pro obviously is getting published versus not. Okay, and as I said earlier, life's just too short now for authors to sit around waiting for a publisher to fall in love with their book to the extent where they're prepared to make the kind of investment that is required to publish a book, because it is significant. And so I think, and then the biggest con, of course, is the cost associated with it, because to do it properly, you really need to spend a fairly significant amount of money. You're talking many thousands of dollars on an average book for good editorial input, especially if it's a structural edit up front. Good design for your cover, good typesetting for the internals. The printing is relatively easy because there are, a small group of very capable book printers around who, are competitive. Or if you go the POD route, most of the print on demand options now are relatively good when it comes to print quality itself. The paper stocks are still a problem for print on demand because a lot of the POD printers use a heavier paper stock that doesn't bulk up as well. One has to think about these things because if you want your book to be in a bookshop, the bookseller buying it has to feel like it's a real book. And a lot of the titles that have been printed using POD they're quite heavy and they don't bulk up really well, and you can actually tell at a glance, without even opening the book, you can tell if it's been printed on demand because it's the weighting is a bit wrong. And readers, I think, are becoming sort of accustomed to that because many people who are now buying POD titles, especially online, when they get the book, they don't really care, as long as it's legible and the content's great, they're being desensitized to it. But the decision makers, the buyers for the booksellers, whether that be at a sort of a national account level for the chains or for your individual bookshop, they're still quite fussy about book formats and book production, and perhaps a bit prejudiced against the POD title. So going the self-publishing option, especially if you're going to be using POD, these are risks you need to be aware of. That it will be very hard for you, if not impossible, to actually get into bookshops. You'll have to consign yourself to selling mostly through e-commerce channels and resellers. And if you're comfortable with that, that's okay. And authors increasingly are. The other cons are choosing the wrong partners to work with. I mean, I can't tell you how many times per week where we get, projects coming across our desks that have already gone the whole way down that pathway, especially if they've used any one of a number of what I call rogue operators, both in the local and international markets, who charge an absolute fortune for very poor quality outcomes. And a good edit is not just about a proofreading through it and correcting some spelling and some punctuation. That's not at all what you're looking for. And if you're paying anything more than $500, you have a right to expect the quality of the editorial input to be better than just a proofread. So I mean, those are the ones that come to mind immediately. There are others as well. I mean, if you don't have a pathway to market mapped out, I'd say don't spend any money yet until you can find a way to get the book into the hands of consumers. Because if you don't have a distributor, or somebody who can do the logistics for you to actually get those books into the hands of those decision makers and potentially stock onto shelves, or at least stock into the warehouses for your online channels, then just having a book actually in hand is, that's the easy part. The hard part is reaching the market through those supply chains that I mentioned. That's really important, and that's actually quite a hard part of the author journey as well. It can actually be harder to find a distributor than it is to find a publisher. And so that's something that's really worth thinking about.
Yeah, it is interesting, and it is like seeing how many kind of cogs there are even within the self-publishing route, which is making sure if you want to do it in a professional capacity, or in a capacity where you want to have it in bookshops and stuff, just doing things like making sure that your distributor is right, making sure that the product you're producing is good, and on top of it, making sure that you're getting value for your money, which I think is really valuable. I think we've only got time probably for one last question. And I know that you kind of pretty much have covered throughout this entire kind of examination of each of the routes available to people. But if you are an author, say you have your manuscript, you're there, you're ready to go, it has gone through that edit. How do you determine what way is best for you? In the end, does it come down to what you actually want to achieve with your book?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question to ask yourself at the very beginning of the process. And it's different for fiction versus nonfiction. Because obviously, if you've written a novel, you've told a story, and you want to get it into the hands of people who like to read stories in that category, whether it be, more literary fiction, or, a romance title, or crime thriller, or a YA novel. You clearly just want to get into the hands of people who like to read that. If you're a nonfiction author, we find a lot of people who write nonfiction are experts in their subject, thought leaders in a particular, business category, and what they want is a calling card, really, to build their credibility as an expert in that field. And one of my colleagues refers to it as a heavy business card, which is a good way to look at it. Mm. And if you're setting out to establish your credentials in a particular field, and you want a book to do that, that's not a bad idea. But then you need to understand that the investment that you're going to make in producing that book may never be recovered from sales of the book. Mm. And if you're comfortable with that, that's okay. And in some ways, when you're looking at the self-publishing route, the same applies. Because if you think about it, if you spend $2,000 on a good edit and a proofreading, and $1,500 on a cover, and $1,500 in typesetting, that's $5,000. And if you print 500 units at $4 a piece, which is doable nowadays, that's $7,000. And you've got, half a pallet of books in your garage to show for it. That's a lot of money to spend. And in the sort of traditional publishing model, if you were, doing it for a royalty, you'd be earning between, 10 and 15% of the recommended retail price is your royalty. So that's somewhere between, $2.50 and $4 for a $30 book. And so you've got to sell, certainly if you sold all 500 at $20, you're not going to recover your investment. So you've kind of got to ask yourself, is it okay for me to do this because I've achieved my goal, which was to finish a book, and I've seen it physically published, and it's something for me to build on, but I don't necessarily have an expectation to recover all that investment? That's okay. If you want to make money from it, then you really need to get your head around the business end of things. Keep your costs as low as possible at every step, and obviously make sure that you can print and sell the kinds of volumes that's going to give you that return. And I should say that, if you're going to work through a distributor, some distributors require a discount off the recommended retail price of up to 75%. And so, you don't get those margins. The bookseller at the end of the supply chain gets the biggest margin, usually around 50% of the RRP. Publishers make very little money from their part of the supply chain, which is why, even a big company like Penguin Random House, Marcus Dorler, the global CEO, said in an interview last year that more than 50% of the books that they publish globally don't earn out. Mm. And so most of their profit comes from a small number of bestsellers that really perform well beyond expectation. And so as a self-published author, you're one person and one book at a time against the machinery of hundreds of thousands, coming out of the sort of the publishing industry. So you've got to be pragmatic about what's doable.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to kind of end this, because it's just a matter of figuring out exactly what you want to do. Similarly to how you're writing your book, the audience you want to achieve with that to get to with that book, publishing plays a massive part of that. Thank you so much for your pearls of wisdom on this. I understand it is a very, very complicated topic of discussion. And for our viewers as well, be sure to check out Booktopia Publishing in the description. I'll be linking them there. I hope that this episode has kind of debunked some misconceptions about the world of publishing and just how complicated it is, because it can seem very intimidating from the outside. But thank you so much, Francois. It's been great to chat to you about this space.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
So for all of our listeners, tune in to episode 3 of A Little Idea next week. We've talked about completing that first draft. Tonight we've talked about getting published, but next week we'll delve into something that Francois was talking about a little bit more at the start of this episode, but the process of molding your book into its final form. We're going to be talking about the world of editing. So my name is Nick Wasiliev, and I'm the author of When Men Cry, which you'll see links to down in the description below. Please be sure to check out episodes of A Little Idea in our playlist as well below. Francois, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for joining me today.
Great, thank you.
Never really noticed the morning sun till the winter came along and stole it all. And if the clouds would only just go away, I'd give it all for a minute of another day.